When the nurse found him, it took Jacob McAllister's breath away. The sight of her pendant, a pendant so familiar it made his heart stop, was identical to the one his daughter had worn when she vanished all those years ago. As he gripped the steering wheel of his high-end sedan, his knuckles went white and his mind raced. The road stretched out before him, empty and unfamiliar under the storm's fury. Charleston's streets usually felt like second nature to him, but tonight, the storm had transformed them into a labyrinth of danger. The downpour hammered relentlessly against his windshield, blurring everything beyond a few feet. The wipers fought against the downpour, their rhythmic screech cutting through the otherwise silent car. But Jacob's focus wasn't on the road, it was on Emily. His daughter had been gone for 2 decades, and not a single day had passed without him thinking of her. He'd followed every lead, every shred of evidence. None of it ever amounted to anything. The hunt had consumed him, drained the joy out of his life, leaving behind a hollow man who no longer knew how to enjoy his own success. What was the point of all his wealth if he couldn't bring his daughter home? Without warning, the car slid. Jacob's heart leapt into his throat as the tires lost their grip on the slick pavement. He tightened his hold on the wheel, desperately trying to regain control, but it was no use. The car veered off the road, slamming through the guardrail and tumbling down a steep slope. The crash was violent. His head collided with the window and everything went dark. When he came to, the rain was still pouring relentlessly, and pain coursed through his body. Each breath felt like a battle. He could hear the faint sound of rain tapping against the twisted metal of his car, and the distant rumble of thunder. Dazed, he tried to move but found himself trapped, pinned by the wreckage. His vision was a blur, but through the haze he saw her, a figure approaching in the downpour, lit by the headlights of an approaching car. For a moment his heart stopped. Was he seeing things? Was this some sort of hallucination? The figure knelt beside him. "Hey, stay with me." A woman's voice called out, calm and soothing. "You're going to be okay." Jacob blinked, trying to focus, his mind catching up with the present moment. This wasn't Emily. It was a stranger. "I'm Mia," she said, gently placing her hand on his. "I'm a nurse. Help is on the way." The softness of her touch, gentle but reassuring, as she checked his injuries, made him feel more grounded. He could barely move, but her presence, her steady breathing, offered some comfort amidst the chaos. As the rain continued to fall, Mia leaned closer, her face becoming visible in the dim light. And that's when he saw it. The necklace. His breath hitched in his chest. It couldn't be. But there it was, hanging from her neck. A simple silver chain with a small heart-shaped pendant. He recognized it immediately. He had given that pendant to Emily on her 10th birthday. His mind raced, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade into the distance. "Where did you get that necklace?" he whispered, his voice weak, barely audible, but the question escaped him before he could stop it. Mia glanced down at the pendant, brushing it lightly with her fingers. "Oh, this? I've had it as long as I can remember," she said. "I was adopted. This is the only thing I have left from my birth family." Jacob's world spun. Adopted?
Pendant.
Could it be? No, he couldn't allow himself to believe it. He'd been down this road before, chasing false hope and ending up heartbroken each time. But something about Mia felt different. This moment, this feeling was different. "Where are you from?" he asked, his voice gaining strength despite the pain. "Where did you grow up?" "I was found abandoned near a hospital in Savannah, Georgia," Mia replied, shrugging as though it were the most casual thing in the world. "Nobody knew who I was, so I ended up in foster care before being adopted." Savannah. His heart skipped a beat. Emily had disappeared near Savannah. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but Jacob wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. He had been wrong so many times before. He needed evidence. He needed more before he could ask the tough questions. The sound of sirens broke through his thoughts, and Mia looked up. "The ambulance is here," she said, relief evident in her voice. "You're going to be okay." Jacob wasn't so sure. His body might survive, but his heart was a whirlwind of hope and doubt. As the paramedics extracted him from the wreckage, his eyes remained locked on Mia. The pendant glittered under the ambulance lights, a symbol of both loss and hope. Could this be the moment he had been waiting for all these years? Later, in the sterile confines of the hospital, Jacob lay in a bed, bruised and stiff from the crash. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the room, but his thoughts were far from his injuries. They were consumed with Mia, and the pendant. The necklace that he had once given to Emily now haunted him. Was it possible? Could Mia be his daughter Emily, lost to him for so long? He had to be careful. He had chased too many dead ends before, desperately holding on to hope, only to have it crumble. But something about this felt different. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. His business associate Paul entered looking concerned. "Jacob, man, you're lucky to be alive," Paul said, pulling up a chair beside him. "How are you feeling?" Jacob managed a weak smile. "I've had better days," he rasped. The crash had been bad, but there was something else gnawing at him. "The nurse who found me." "Mia," Jacob continued, his voice faltering. "She was wearing a necklace, the same pendant I gave to Emily before she disappeared. She told me she was adopted and found abandoned near Savannah. I can't stop thinking, what if it's her? What if she's Emily?" Paul leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "Jacob, I know how much you want this to be true, but you need to be careful. We've been down this road before. Don't rush to conclusions." Jacob rubbed his temples, frustration building. I know, but there's something about this, Paul." "The pendant." "Savannah. It's too much to be a coincidence." Paul studied Jacob for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right, we won't rule anything out. What's your plan?" Jacob had already been mulling over it. "I need to know the truth for sure. I'll arrange for a DNA test, but I'll do it quietly. I don't want to get anyone's hopes up, especially not mine, until I have answers." Paul thought for a moment, his mind clearly working. "I can reach out to someone who can set that up discreetly, but it'll take a few days." "That's fine," Jacob replied. "The sooner the better." As Paul left, Jacob's mind immediately returned to Mia. She was a mystery to him. She seemed so kind, so selfless. It wasn't just the necklace, it was the way she carried herself. There was something familiar about her, something that reminded him of Emily, as if a part of his daughter still lingered in her. But he couldn't jump to conclusions. He had been wrong before, and that kind of heartbreak had nearly broken him. Before he could dwell further on his thoughts, a soft knock interrupted. Mia was standing in the doorway, her expression uncertain. She gave him a small smile as she stepped inside. "I just wanted to check on you," she said. "The doctor said you're stable, which is good." Jacob sat up slightly, wincing at the pain in his side. "I'm fine, thanks to you. You saved my life." Mia blushed, dismissing the praise. "I was just in the right place at the right time." As she came closer, Jacob's eyes were immediately drawn to the pendant again. It caught the soft hospital light, a constant reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he might still find. He cleared his throat. "Listen, that necklace you're wearing," he began, his voice cautious. "I used to know someone who had one just like it." Mia instinctively touched the pendant, her fingers curling around it. "Yeah, I've had this since I was a baby. It's the only thing I have left from before I was adopted." "Why?" Jacob hesitated, struggling to find the right words. He couldn't tell her the whole truth, not yet. "It just reminds me of someone I lost a long time ago. That's all." Mia nodded, though there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She studied him for a moment, as though she sensed there was more he wasn't saying. But instead of pressing, she simply smiled. "Well, I'm glad I could help. If you need anything, just let me know." She turned to leave, but Jacob's voice stopped her. "Mia, do you know anything about your birth parents?" His heart was pounding in his chest as he asked. Mia's gaze dropped, and there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "No," she said softly. "I've thought about trying to find them, but I guess I've always been afraid of what I might discover. Maybe they didn't want me." Jacob's chest tightened. She had no idea how wrong she was. If Mia was really Emily, he had never stopped wanting her. He had never stopped searching. "Sometimes the past isn't what we think it is," Jacob said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "Sometimes it's worth looking into." Mia gave him a soft smile. "Maybe one day." As she left the room, Jacob's resolve solidified. He would uncover the truth no matter what it took. And if Mia was really Emily, his daughter, He would never let her slip away again. Later, Jacob lay awake in the hospital bed, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't escape. He glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. The stillness of the hospital around him was in stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside. Mia had just left his room a few hours ago, and her words still echoed in his mind. She didn't know who her birth parents were. She had lived her whole life believing she had been unwanted. But what if she had been wanted desperately by him? He couldn't stop thinking about it, turning the idea over in his mind like a puzzle he couldn't solve. He knew the risks of getting his hopes up. He had been crushed too many times before. But this time felt different. The pendant. Savannah. Her age. It all lined up too perfectly. He needed answers and he needed them now. Just then his phone buzzed from the bedside table, cutting through his thoughts. It was Paul. "I've set up a meeting with a private investigator," Paul texted. "Her name's Alice Turner. She's discreet and experienced. She'll be at your office tomorrow afternoon." Jacob exhaled slowly, a sense of relief mingling with the anxiety in his chest. "Thanks, Paul. I'm not sure what I'm hoping to find, but I can't shake this feeling." "Just be prepared," Paul warned in his reply. "Whatever happens, it's going to stir up a lot of old wounds." Jacob sighed. "I know." His voice dropped to a whisper. "But if there's even a chance Mia is Emily, I have to follow it." The next day, Jacob insisted on leaving the hospital early, against the doctor's wishes. He couldn't stand to lie in bed any longer waiting for answers. His body ached with each movement, but the urgency to get to the bottom of Mia's past drove him through the pain. By mid-afternoon, Jacob found himself back in his office, a cold, sterile place that felt a world away from the turmoil inside him. Alice Turner, the private investigator, was already there. She was sharp and efficient, with piercing blue eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She wasted no time getting to the point. "You've given me the basics over the phone," Alice said, taking out a notepad. "Mia Whitman, adopted, found abandoned near a hospital in Savannah. You think she could be your daughter?" Jacob nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yes. My daughter, Emily, disappeared when she was 10. I've been searching for her ever since. There are too many coincidences with Mia." Alice scribbled notes, her expression unreadable. "Coincidences happen a lot in my line of work. But I'll dig into this. I'll start with her adoption records and see what I can uncover." Jacob hesitated before speaking again, his voice low. "There's something else. I think my sister, Margaret, might have been involved in Emily's disappearance." Alice raised an eyebrow but kept her composure. "That's a serious accusation." "I know," Jacob admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there are things from the past that don't add up. Margaret and I, well, we've had our issues. She was always jealous of me, the attention I got from our parents. She hated how close I was to Emily. I need to know if she had anything to do with what happened." Alice closed her notebook, standing up. "I'll look into everything. Adoption records, your sister, whatever it takes. But be prepared for what we might find. This could unearth a lot of things you're not ready to face." Jacob nodded grimly. He'd lived under the shadow of Emily's disappearance for 20 years. Whatever came next, he was ready for it. As Alice left his office, Jacob leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His heart pounded, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. For 2 decades he had tried to piece together what happened to Emily, only to be left with more questions than answers. Now, with Mia in the picture, everything felt like it was both falling apart and coming together at the same time. That evening, Jacob returned to the hospital to visit Mia. He brought a bouquet of flowers as a small token of his gratitude, though it seemed inadequate for someone who might have just saved his life, and possibly so much more. Mia was sitting up in bed when he arrived, a book in her hands. She looked up surprised but smiled when she saw him. "I wasn't expecting you," Mia said, setting the book aside. Jacob gently placed the flowers on her bedside table. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did," he said. Mia waved it off with a smile. "It's part of the job. No need to thank me. I've been thinking a lot." Jacob began carefully, choosing his words. "You told me you were adopted. Do you ever wonder about your birth parents?" Mia's expression softened, but there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. "Sometimes," she said quietly, But I've made peace with it. My adoptive family has been good to me, and I'm grateful for them. Whoever my birth parents were, they had their reasons for letting me go. Jacob's heart tightened in his chest. She had no idea what she'd been through. And if she was Emily, she hadn't been abandoned, she'd been taken. I just think it's important to know where you come from, Jacob said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. Mia looked at him, curiosity flickering in her gaze. Maybe one day I'll look into it, she said thoughtfully. Jacob nodded, his resolve hardening. He couldn't tell her the truth just yet, not until he had proof, but soon he would know one way or another. The next morning, Jacob woke with a heavy sense of anticipation. He had spoken to Alice late the night before, and the DNA test was already being arranged. The results would take a few days, but just knowing things were moving forward made him feel restless. He spent the morning pacing around his house, attempting to focus on work, but nothing could distract him from thoughts of Mia and Emily. He knew he had to stay calm, but every time he pictured Mia's face, a surge of hope rushed through him. There was something about her, something in her eyes, in the way she carried herself that felt so familiar. But it could all be a coincidence. He had to remind himself of that again and again. When Jacob visited Mia in the hospital that afternoon, he found her sitting by the window, bathed in the soft glow of the sun as it filtered through the curtains. She stared out at the city skyline, lost in thought, her fingers absently toying with the pendant around her neck. "Hey," Jacob said softly as he entered the room, careful not to startle her. Mia turned to face him, her smile warm. "Hey yourself. I wasn't sure you'd come by today." Jacob walked over to the chair beside her bed and sat down, doing his best to mask the anxiety gnawing at him since he'd woken up that morning. "I wanted to check on you," he said, trying to sound casual. "See how you're doing." Mia shrugged, a small smile on her lips. "I'm fine. The doctors say I'll be out of here soon." For a moment they sat in silence, and Jacob could feel the weight of unsaid things hanging between them. He knew he couldn't bring up the questions on his mind just yet. He had to wait for the DNA results before he could ask anything too direct. But Mia beat him to it. "So why do I get the feeling that every time you come in here, you have something on your mind that you're not saying?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. There was curiosity in her gaze, but also a calmness, as though she had been waiting for him to speak. Jacob's throat tightened. She wasn't wrong. He had been holding back and it was getting harder with every visit. But this was delicate. He had to be careful with his words. "You're right," he admitted with a small sigh. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you, but I didn't want to overstep." Mia tilted her head slightly, her curiosity piqued. "Go on." Jacob took a deep breath, steadying himself. "The pendant," he began, choosing his words carefully. "It's the same as one I gave to someone very important to me a long time ago. That's why I reacted the way I did when I saw it." Mia's hand instinctively went to the necklace, her fingers brushing the delicate chain. "I didn't know that," she said softly. "It's always been with me, but I've never known where it came from. Just that it's from before I was adopted." Jacob nodded, his voice tight. I lost someone years ago. My daughter. And this necklace was one of the last things I gave her before she disappeared." Mia's expression softened, and she looked at him with an understanding that caught him off guard. "I'm sorry, Jacob. That must have been incredibly hard." "It was," Jacob said quietly, his voice low. "And seeing that pendant on you, it brought up a lot of memories, a lot of feelings." Mia hesitated before speaking again, her voice quiet but steady. "Do you think there's a chance?" She didn't finish the question, but Jacob knew exactly what she was asking. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "I've been trying not to jump to conclusions. I've been down this road before, and I've been wrong before. But I can't ignore the possibility." Mia looked down at the pendant again, her brow furrowing. "I've always wondered about my birth parents. I've thought about looking for them. But I never had anything to go on. Just this necklace." Jacob's heart clenched at her words. If Mia was really Emily, she had spent her whole life believing she was unwanted, not knowing the truth, that she hadn't been abandoned but taken. "I've arranged for a DNA test," Jacob said gently. "I didn't want to tell you until I was sure, but it's already in the works. It'll tell us whether or not you're my daughter. Mia's eyes widened in surprise, and a hint of disbelief flickered in her gaze. A DNA test? You really think I could be? Jacob nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. There's a chance, Mia. And I need to know for sure. But I don't want to get your hopes up. I don't want to get mine up either. We'll just have to wait for the results. Mia sank back into her bed, looking thoughtful, almost lost in the weight of the situation. I don't even know how to process all of this, she said, her voice soft, almost unsure. I've spent my entire life not knowing who I really am. And now, all of a sudden, I might have the answers. Jacob reached out, his hand finding hers with surprising gentleness. Whatever happens, he said, his voice steady but full of warmth, we'll go through it together. One step at a time. She squeezed his hand in return, her grip just as firm, her eyes meeting his with quiet resolve. Okay. One step at a time. The following days crawled by at an agonizing pace. Each minute seemed to drag on endlessly as Jacob waited for the DNA test results, his mind trapped in a constant state of uncertainty. Hope and fear warred inside him, and the doubt that had clung to him for so many years resurfaced, reminding him of how many times he had let himself believe, only to have that belief shattered. He tried to focus on work to keep his mind occupied with anything, but it was no use. Mia's face, her voice, and the possibility that she might be Emily haunted him. Could she really be his daughter? After all this time, could the pieces finally be falling into place? By the third day, Alice, the private investigator, finally called. Her voice was cool and professional as ever, though he could detect an undercurrent of curiosity in her tone. I've started digging into Mia's past, Alice said, her words measured but filled with purpose. It wasn't easy. Adoption records are notoriously difficult to get to. But I found a few things that might be useful. Jacob sat up, suddenly alert. His heart picked up its pace. What did you find? Alice paused before answering. Well, as you know, Mia was found abandoned near a hospital in Savannah when she was just a baby. There wasn't any identifying information with her. Not even a note. No birth certificate, nothing. She was taken in by the hospital staff and eventually she went into foster care. A couple of years later, she was adopted by a family in the area. They seemed to be decent people. Nothing unusual about them at all. Jacob clenched his jaw, trying to stay composed. So no clues about her birth parents? Alice's voice dropped slightly as she continued. Not exactly. But there's something odd. The hospital records note that when Mia was found, she was wearing that pendant you mentioned. It's the only thing that stood out. The staff made a point of recording it, but there's no follow-up. No one seemed to care about where it came from, or if it had any significance. Jacob's chest tightened. That pendant. It had to mean something. It was the only link. Anything else? Any witnesses or people who might have seen something? Nothing, Alice replied. It's like she appeared out of nowhere. There was no report of a missing child matching her description, and no one came forward to claim her. It's a dead end as far as leads go. Jacob leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. The weight of her words was sinking in. And what about Margaret? Did you find any connection to her in all this? Alice's tone shifted, becoming more cautious. I haven't found anything concrete yet, but there's something I'm not comfortable with. Margaret was in Savannah around the time Mia was found. There are records of her being there, handling business in the area. It might be a coincidence, but it's worth checking. Jacob's heart sank at the mention of his sister. Could Margaret really have been involved? The thought of her being connected to this, possibly even responsible for what happened to Emily, was too much to bear. I'll keep looking, Alice said, her voice steady but carrying a hint of caution. But be prepared. If Margaret was involved, finding proof won't be easy. She's been careful about covering her tracks. Jacob nodded, his face grim. I understand. Just keep me posted. After the call ended, Jacob sat in his office, his mind spinning in 1,000 directions. What did it all mean? If Mia really was Emily, and if Margaret had played a role in her disappearance, it could tear the family apart. But Jacob had spent too long in the dark. He needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Later that evening, Jacob went to visit Mia at her apartment. She had been discharged from the hospital the day before, And while she still had a few aches from the accident, she was clearly recovering well. Her apartment was small but inviting. A cozy space full of personality. It was a far cry from Jacob's sprawling mansion, and he couldn't help but wonder what her life would have been like if things had turned out differently. "Hey!" Mia greeted him with a warm smile when she opened the door. "Come on in." Jacob stepped inside, glancing around at the comfortable, lived-in feel of the place. Photos of Mia with her adoptive family decorated the walls, capturing moments of joy from birthdays, vacations, and graduations. It was clear that she had been loved, even though she had never known her real parents. "I was just making some tea," Mia said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Want some?" "Sure," Jacob replied, following her into the kitchen. They settled at the table with their tea, and Mia glanced up at him with a curious look. "So you mentioned you had a private investigator looking into my past?" she asked, her tone gentle. Jacob nodded. "Yeah, I know it's a lot, but I wanted to make sure we weren't missing anything. I didn't want to leave any stone unturned." Mia's expression softened. "I appreciate that," she said. "I've always wondered about where I came from, but I never really had the courage to dig into it. I guess I was afraid of what I might find." Jacob's heart tightened in his chest. She had no idea just how close they were to the truth. "I understand," he said quietly. "But sometimes the truth is worth finding, even when it's hard." Mia nodded, looking down at her tea. "Yeah, maybe you're right." Jacob hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Alice, the investigator, found out a little more about your past. There wasn't much, but she did confirm that the pendant you've always had was noted in the hospital records. It was with you when they found you." Mia's eyes widened slightly. "The pendant. It's the only thing I've ever had from before I was adopted. It's like a piece of me." Jacob's heart ached as he looked at her. He couldn't tell her everything just yet, but he knew they were getting closer. Closer to the truth, closer to the answers they both desperately needed. On the fourth morning, Jacob sat at his desk, his eyes unfocused, staring at a report that he couldn't bring himself to read. He was lost in a sea of thoughts, his mind racing with questions, doubts, and the ever-present ache of anticipation. And then, just as the silence in the office seemed to grow unbearable, the phone rang. He reached for it quickly, his hands trembling slightly, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Alice," came the familiar voice on the other end. "I've got the results." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath as 1,000 scenarios played out in his mind. The brief silence on the line seemed to stretch on forever. Then Alice spoke again, her voice calm but firm, like the sound of a door finally unlocking. "Jacob, the DNA test confirms it. Mia is Emily. She's your daughter." The world stopped. Jacob's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he couldn't move. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. He sat back in his chair, feeling as though the room had tilted beneath him. Mia. Emily. His daughter. The little girl he had lost so many years ago, alive. The pendant. The adoption. The coincidences. They were no longer coincidences. Everything he had held on to, every shred of hope, was suddenly real. His emotions surged: relief, joy, disbelief, all tangled in a storm of feelings that threatened to drown him. But with that wave of emotion came a sobering realization. This was only the beginning. Mia didn't know the truth yet, and there was still the matter of Margaret to deal with. "Jacob." Alice's voice pulled him back to the present, her tone softer now. "Are you still there?" "Yes," Jacob replied, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." "I know this is a lot to process," Alice said gently. "But there's more. I've been digging into Margaret's background like you asked, and there are things that don't quite add up." Jacob's relief shifted quickly to something darker, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. "What do you mean?" he asked, the unease settling in. "I looked into Margaret's travel records from around the time of Emily's disappearance, about 20 years ago," Alice explained. "She was in Savannah on multiple occasions. At first it seemed like routine business trips, but there were some oddities. Gaps in her schedule. Unexplained expenses. It doesn't prove anything outright, but it raises some red flags." Jacob's blood ran cold. He had suspected Margaret for years, But hearing it all laid out like this made the possibility feel much more real. Jacob, Alice continued, her voice firm, I think there's a strong chance Margaret was involved in what happened to Emily. I'm not sure to what extent, but it's clear she was in the area when Emily went missing. Jacob's fists clenched. The familiar, raw feeling of anger and betrayal boiled up inside him. How could she? How could his own sister have been involved? How could she have taken his daughter and left him to suffer through all this? I need proof, Jacob said, his voice hard and steady despite the storm inside him. I need to confront her, but I can't do it without something solid. I'll keep digging, Alice promised, her voice lowering. But be careful. This is going to get messy. Jacob hung up the phone, his mind spinning. He had found his daughter, but now he had to face the darkness within his own family. He didn't know how he would confront Margaret, but one thing was clear. He couldn't let her get away with it. Later that evening, Jacob sat parked in his car outside Mia's apartment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as his mind raced. How would he tell her the truth? How would he explain that her whole life had been built on a lie? That she wasn't Mia Whitman, she was Emily McAllister, his daughter. For 20 years he had waited for this moment, but now that it was here, he had no idea how to start. His chest tightened and he closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm in his head. Finally, he took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. He couldn't wait any longer. Mia opened the door, her usual smile fading the instant she saw his face. Jacob? She asked, concern flickering in her eyes. What's wrong? He stepped inside, the weight of the truth heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't keep this from her any longer. She deserved to know. Mia, we need to talk, Jacob said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Her expression shifted instantly, worry creasing her brow. You're scaring me. What is it? Jacob walked to the small living room and sat down, his hands trembling as he tried to find the words. I've been doing some digging into your past, into who you really are. And I have the results of the DNA test. Mia's eyes widened, and her breath hitched as she stood frozen for a moment. Jacob's voice faltered. Mia, you're my daughter. You're Emily. There was a long pause. Mia just stared at him, her eyes wide with shock, as if she couldn't comprehend what he was saying. Then slowly she shook her head, her voice breaking with disbelief. No, that can't be true, she whispered. That can't be possible. She sat down on the couch, her face pale, as her mind scrambled to process the bombshell Jacob had just dropped. The words echoed in her head, you're my daughter. You're Emily. It didn't make sense. Her whole life she had been Mia Whitman, the girl who was adopted, the girl who grew up in Savannah. How could all of that be a lie? Jacob watched her, his heart aching as he saw the confusion, the shock, and the disbelief washing over her. He knew this was too much to take in all at once, and he didn't blame her for struggling to believe it. But he had spent 20 years waiting for this moment. He couldn't let it slip away now. Mia, Jacob said softly, leaning forward. I know it's hard to believe, but the DNA test proves it. You're my daughter, Emily. I've been searching for you since you disappeared. For 20 years. Mia shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. But I don't remember anything. I don't remember being Emily. How could I not know? Jacob's voice caught in his throat. You were only 10 when you were taken. It's possible that over time you buried those memories. Or maybe you were just too young to hold on to them. But I never stopped looking for you, Mia. Not once. Not for a single day. Tears welled in Mia's eyes as Jacob's words sank in. She had always wondered about her birth parents. Always felt the emptiness of not knowing where she came from. But she had never expected something like this. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Mia asked, her voice trembling. Why wait all this time? Jacob sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. I didn't want to get your hopes up. I didn't want to get my hopes up either. I've chased so many dead ends, Mia. Every time I thought I was close, I was crushed. I couldn't bear to put you through that too. But I had to know for sure. That's why I had the DNA test done. Mia sat back, her mind reeling. Everything she had known about herself, the identity she had built, was suddenly shattered. Mia didn't know how to feel. Her emotions were a chaotic mix. Anger, confusion, grief. All swirling together in a storm that she couldn't begin to sort out. The revelation that she was Emily, Jacob's daughter, hit her harder than she could have ever expected. She felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath her, leaving her in freefall. Jacob watched her, his heart heavy with understanding. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but he knew better. This was a moment she needed to process on her own. He had spent 2 decades grieving the loss of his daughter. But for Mia, the truth that she was Emily was a foundation-shattering revelation. "I understand if this is overwhelming," Jacob said softly, his voice full of compassion. "You don't have to make sense of it all right now. But there's more. There's something else you need to know." Mia looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and hope. "What else?" she asked, her voice shaky, unsure of what to expect next. Jacob hesitated, a knot tightening in his chest. This was the part he had feared. The part that would shatter everything Mia thought she knew about herself, and potentially destroy her perception of his family. "I believe that my sister Margaret was involved in your disappearance," Jacob said, his voice tight with restrained emotion. "She was in Savannah around the time you went missing. And there are things I've uncovered that suggest she had a role in taking you." Mia's eyes widened in disbelief, her voice faltering. "Your sister? Why would she do something like that?" Jacob's fists clenched at his sides, his anger rising. "Margaret has always resented me. She hated that I was always the favorite in our family, that I got more attention and more opportunities. And she was jealous of how close I was to you. I think she wanted to hurt me. And taking you away was the ultimate way to do it." Mia stared at him, stunned. The idea that anyone, let alone his own sister, could harbor such hatred, that they would go so far as to steal a child away, was incomprehensible. She tried to wrap her mind around it, but it felt too monstrous, too impossible. She let you think I was dead?" Mia's voice broke, the pain of that realization sinking in. Jacob's throat tightened, and he exhaled slowly, fighting the wave of emotion that surged through him. "I don't know what she was thinking. I don't know if she ever planned on telling me the truth, but I'm going to confront her. I need to understand why she did this. And I need her to face the consequences." Mia wiped the tears from her eyes, a mixture of shock and anger rippling through her. "I can't believe this. I've lived my whole life not knowing who I really am. And it's because of her." Jacob nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yes, but we're going to get answers, Mia. Promise you." Mia's mind was racing, each new revelation coming too fast for her to fully process. She didn't know whether to feel grateful that she had found her father or furious that someone so close to him had stolen her past. But one thing was clear. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. "What do we do now?" Mia asked, her voice steadier now as she wiped her eyes again. Jacob stood up, his resolve hardening. "Now we confront Margaret. And we get the truth out of her." Later that evening, Jacob found himself standing outside Margaret's sprawling estate, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't been here in years, not since he distanced himself from her, not fully understanding why he felt uneasy around her. But now all the pieces were falling into place. The woman he had once trusted, his own flesh and blood, might be the one responsible for tearing his family apart. As he walked up to the front door, his mind raced with all the questions he wanted to ask, the accusations he needed to make. But he knew this confrontation wouldn't be easy. Margaret was manipulative, calculating, she'd deny everything if she could. He had to stay calm, focused. He needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The door swung open before he could knock, and there stood Margaret. Her sharp features and perfectly styled hair made her look every bit the poised, polished woman she had always been. But Jacob didn't miss the flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe even guilt. "Jacob," she said, her voice smooth but guarded. "This is a surprise. I wasn't expecting you." Jacob stepped inside, his face a mask of determination. "We need to talk." Margaret raised an eyebrow but didn't resist as he entered her home. "Of course. What's this about?" Jacob turned to face her, his anger barely contained. "It's about Emily." Margaret froze for just a second, enough for Jacob to notice. The tension in her posture was unmistakable, but she quickly recovered, adopting a neutral expression. "What about Emily?" she asked, her voice casual but tight. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Jacob said, his voice low and steady. I've spent 20 years searching for her, grieving her loss, and now I know the truth. Mia is Emily. She's alive. For the briefest moment, Jacob saw the flicker of recognition in Margaret's eyes. That was all he needed to confirm his suspicions, but she didn't give in easily. Mia? The nurse from your accident. Margaret feigned confusion, a dismissive smile playing on her lips. Jacob, that's ridiculous. Emily's been gone for years. You've been chasing ghosts. Jacob's fists clenched at his sides, his patience running out. The DNA test proves it, Margaret. She's Emily. And I know you had something to do with her disappearance. The calm mask on Margaret's face began to crack. Her voice turned colder. That's absurd. You've always had a wild imagination, Jacob. But this is too much even for you. Jacob took a step closer, his voice trembling with the weight of 20 years of pain and anger. Don't lie to me, Margaret. I know you were in Savannah around the time Emily disappeared. I've seen the records. You've kept this secret for years. It's time to tell the truth. Margaret's eyes flashed with something dark, fear perhaps or anger. She took a deep breath, crossing her arms as her gaze hardened. You want the truth? Fine, she said, her voice laced with bitterness. Yes, I was in Savannah. I was there on business. And yes, I saw Emily. But it wasn't some grand conspiracy, Jacob. She ran off like she always did. Headstrong just like you. I tried to bring her back, but she didn't want to come. She blamed you for everything. Your constant work, your obsession with control. Jacob felt like he had been punched in the gut. The idea that Emily had run away, blaming him for her disappearance, was more painful than anything he had imagined. But something didn't sit right with Margaret's story. So you just let her go? Jacob demanded, his voice rising. You didn't call me? You didn't think I deserved to know where my daughter was? Margaret shrugged, her expression cold. What was I supposed to do? You were impossible to reach. And by the time I tried to find her again, she was gone. Jacob stared at Margaret, his anger boiling over. You expect me to believe that? That you just lost her? That you didn't have anything to do with her being abandoned near a hospital, wearing the necklace I gave her? Margaret's composure finally cracked. For the first time, Jacob saw genuine fear in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence between them grew thick, pressing down on him, full of unspoken truths. Finally, Margaret's voice broke the silence, her tone barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Jacob's heart clenched. What did you do, Margaret? His voice cracked with emotion, a mix of disbelief and sorrow. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, and for the first time, Jacob saw the guilt she had been hiding all these years. I thought if I took her away, you'd finally understand, she said, her voice breaking. You'd see how much damage your obsession with your work had done to everything. I didn't think she'd disappear like that. I didn't know. Jacob was numb, unable to wrap his mind around her words. His sister, the woman who had been part of his life for as long as he could remember, had taken his daughter, his only child, because of some twisted, misguided attempt to make him see the consequences of his actions. You destroyed my life, Jacob said, his voice shaking with rage. You let me believe my daughter was gone. And for what? To prove a point? Margaret couldn't meet his gaze. She looked down, unable to face the devastation she had caused. I never meant for it to go this far, she whispered. I'm sorry. But Jacob didn't know if he could ever forgive her. He stood there, frozen, staring at his sister as the weight of her betrayal settled like a stone in his chest. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating as the truth sank in. His own sister had stolen his daughter and let him suffer for 2 decades, all because of some twisted resentment and misplaced anger. I didn't mean to hurt you like this, Margaret continued, wiping at her eyes, but her apology sounded hollow. I didn't mean to cause you all this pain. Jacob's hands trembled, a simmering rage bubbling up. You didn't mean to hurt me, Margaret. You destroyed me. You took Emily away from me and you let me think she was gone forever. Margaret's eyes dropped, unable to face him. I was angry, she said softly. I wanted you to feel what I felt. Ignored. Neglected. I wanted you to see what it was like to lose something important. Jacob took a step forward, his voice rising in fury. You took a child, Margaret. You didn't just hurt me, You ruined her life too. Do you even understand what you've done? Margaret flinched but didn't respond. Jacob paced the room, unable to stay still, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. Every moment of the past 20 years flooded back. The sleepless nights, the empty holidays, the constant ache in his chest every time he thought of Emily. And all along Margaret had known. She had known, and she had done nothing. How could you? Jacob's voice was quieter now, but still thick with pain. How could you live with yourself after all this? Margaret finally looked up at him, her face pale, drawn. She spoke, but her words were heavy with regret. I thought I could fix it. After a while I didn't know how to make it right. So I buried it. Tried to move on. Jacob shook his head. Disbelief and disgust filling him. Move on. You let me grieve for years. You let Emily grow up without knowing who she was, without knowing her family. How could you ever fix this? Margaret opened her mouth to say something, but the words never came. She had no excuse, no justification for what she had done. You can't fix this, Jacob said, his voice final. There's nothing you can say that will undo the damage. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, but Jacob couldn't bring himself to feel sympathy. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and there was only one thing left to do. I'm going to tell Mia the truth, Jacob said, his voice steady but resolute. She deserves to know everything. Margaret's eyes widened, panic seeping into her expression. No, Jacob, please, she pleaded. You can't. She deserves to know who took her life away from her. Jacob cut her off, his tone unwavering. She deserves to know the truth. Margaret stepped forward, desperation lacing her voice. I'll lose everything. I'll lose you. I'll lose her. Please, Jacob, don't do this. Jacob met her gaze, feeling the weight of her plea, but his decision was made. You've already lost us, Margaret, he said quietly. You lost us the day you decided to take her. Without another word, Jacob turned and walked out of the room, leaving Margaret standing there, her tear-streaked face frozen in shock. He didn't look back. There was nothing left for him in that house, no more words to exchange. Later that evening, Jacob returned to Mia's apartment. His heart was heavy with the weight of the truth. He had found his daughter after all these years, but the cost was something he hadn't anticipated. Telling Mia about Margaret, about the woman who had torn their lives apart. This was going to be the hardest thing he had ever done. But she needed to know. She deserved to know who had stolen her past. When Mia opened the door, her expression filled with concern. She took one look at his face and her worry deepened. Jacob? What happened? He stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. There's something I need to tell you. They sat down on the couch and Jacob took a deep breath, preparing himself for the conversation that was about to unfold. He looked into Mia's eyes, those same eyes that had once belonged to the little girl he had lost. And now, after 20 years, he had found her again. It's about Margaret, Jacob began, his voice heavy with emotion. She's the reason you disappeared. Mia's eyes widened in shock, her breath catching in her throat. What? What are you talking about? Jacob clenched his fists, fighting to keep his voice steady. Margaret took you. 20 years ago. She took you away from me. She abandoned you near that hospital in Savannah. Mia stared at Jacob, her face frozen in disbelief. No, that can't be true, she whispered, her voice trembling. It is, Jacob said softly, his voice breaking. She did it because she wanted to hurt me. She was angry, jealous, and in her twisted mind, taking you away was her way of getting back at me. Mia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as the weight of his words crashed down on her. I can't believe this. I can't believe someone would do that. Her voice was barely audible, shaking with shock. Jacob reached out and gently took her hand, his own heart aching at the sight of her distress. I'm so sorry, Mia, he said quietly. I'm sorry this happened to you. But I'm here now. And I'm not going to let her hurt you ever again. Mia's tears fell freely, her chest heaving with the weight of everything she had just learned. The truth was more painful than she could have imagined. For years she had lived with the haunting uncertainty of who she really was. And now, with the truth finally out, it felt like everything she had ever known had been torn apart. She sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing as it tried to process the unfathomable truth. The shock of the revelation, the depth of Margaret's betrayal, her role in Mia's disappearance, hit her like a tidal wave. It was all too much. She couldn't wrap her mind around the idea that someone so close to Jacob, someone who was supposed to be family, could have stolen her entire life away. Jacob watched her carefully, unsure of what to say next. His own grief over losing his daughter was a lifetime of pain that Mia now had to confront. But this time it wasn't the loss of a child. This was a child who had been taken from her, robbed of a life she should have had. Finally Mia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to feel. She looked up at Jacob, her eyes filled with raw emotion. How could she do that to me? How could she do that to you? Jacob squeezed her hand tightly, his heart breaking for her. I don't know, Mia. I wish I had an answer. I've been asking myself the same question. Margaret. She's always been jealous of me. I never thought she could do something like this. But she did. Mia looked at him, the weight of the revelation sinking deeper. She let me think I was abandoned. She let me believe that no one wanted me. Jacob's chest tightened and without thinking, he pulled her into a gentle embrace. I wanted you, Mia, he said, his voice soft with emotion. I never stopped looking for you. I never gave up. Mia clung to him, her tears soaking into his shirt as she let the reality of everything she had lost wash over her. Her childhood, her sense of belonging, her family. All of it had been taken from her because of Margaret's twisted vendetta. For years she had felt like something was missing. Now she understood why. After a long moment, Mia pulled back and wiped her eyes, her voice trembling but firm. What happens now? What are we going to do? Jacob sighed, his jaw tightening as he looked at her. Margaret has to face the consequences of what she's done. She can't just walk away from this. Mia nodded, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. Do you think she'll ever admit to what she did? Or will she just keep lying? Jacob's face darkened, the anger that had been building for years surfacing once more. I don't know. But it doesn't matter. We have the proof. The DNA test proves who you are. And we have enough evidence to show that Margaret was in Savannah when you disappeared. Whether she admits it or not, she's going to have to answer for what she did. Mia sat quietly, her hands trembling as she processed the enormity of it all. The idea of confronting Margaret, of facing the woman who had taken her life away, filled her with a mix of fear and anger. But she knew she had to do it. She couldn't move forward until she had confronted the truth head-on. I want to be there, Mia said suddenly, her voice firm. When you confront her, I want to hear what she has to say. Jacob hesitated, unsure if that was the best idea. He didn't want to put Mia through more pain. But he understood her need for closure. Are you sure? He asked softly. Mia nodded, her eyes hardening with determination. I'm sure. I need to hear it from her. I need to know why. Jacob took a deep breath and nodded. All right. We'll do it together. The next day, Jacob arranged for a meeting with Margaret. He didn't tell her what it was about, only that it was urgent and that she needed to come to his office. Margaret agreed, though her voice over the phone carried a note of hesitation. She must have known on some level that her lies were starting to unravel. When Margaret arrived, she walked into the office with her usual air of confidence. But the moment she saw Mia sitting beside Jacob, her posture faltered. Her eyes flicked nervously between them, and she quickly masked her unease with a tight smile. Jacob. Mia. Margaret greeted them, her voice strained. What's this about? Jacob didn't waste any time. He stood up and faced his sister, his expression cold and resolute. It's about what you did. It's about Emily. Margaret's face went pale. Jacob, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Jacob interrupted, his voice sharp. We know everything. Mia is Emily. The DNA test confirmed it, and we know you were the one who took her. Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. The room was filled with a heavy silence as Jacob's accusation hung in the air. Mia stared at Margaret, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to confess. But instead, Margaret's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. I was trying to protect her, Margaret finally said, her voice low. I was trying to protect her from you. Jacob's eyes flashed with anger. Protect her? You abandoned her, Margaret. You left her to grow up without her family, without knowing who she really was. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but there was no remorse in her voice. You were destroying her, Jacob. You were obsessed with your work, with control. She needed to get away from you. Mia stood up, her voice trembling with rage. You didn't protect me. You stole my life. Margaret looked at Mia, her face contorted with a mix of guilt and defiance. I was trying to save you. No, Mia said, her voice cold. You were trying to punish him. And you ruined both our lives in the process. The room fell silent after Mia's words, her voice lingering in the air like the aftermath of a storm. Margaret stood there, frozen, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. For a moment it seemed like she might fight back, deny everything, twist the truth as she always had. But as she looked into Mia's eyes, something shifted. Mia's eyes met Margaret's, and something in her seemed to break. The veneer of control Margaret had maintained over the years cracked, and for the first time, Jacob saw the depth of her regret. I never meant for this to happen, Margaret whispered, her voice shaking. I thought I was doing the right thing. Jacob stood rooted to the spot, his anger mixing with sorrow. The woman standing in front of him, consumed by bitterness and regret, was a stranger. He had known Margaret his whole life, but this woman felt alien to him. No, Jacob said quietly, his voice thick with restrained pain. You didn't do the right thing, Margaret. You took everything from us. You destroyed our family. And for what? To punish me? Margaret wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept falling. I didn't know what to do, she choked out. I was so angry, so jealous. You had everything, Jacob. The success, the attention, the love from our parents. And I had nothing. Jacob shook his head in disbelief, his voice rising. So you took the one thing that mattered most to me. You took my daughter. You let her grow up thinking she wasn't wanted, that she was abandoned. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Margaret flinched at his accusations, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she turned to Mia, her eyes pleading for understanding. Emily, she whispered, using the name she had known her by. Mia, I know I hurt you. I know I can never make up for what I did. But I swear to you, I thought I was helping you. I thought you'd be better off without him. Mia's face was unreadable as she stood there, arms crossed, listening to Margaret's desperate plea. You didn't care about me, she said, her voice steady but cold. You cared about hurting Jacob. That's all this ever was. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat. Mia's words were too sharp, too true. Deep down, Margaret knew it had always been about her own jealousy, her own bitterness, and her desire to lash out. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. Jacob let out a slow, deep breath, his emotions a whirlwind inside him. For years, he had imagined what it would be like to confront the person responsible for taking Emily from him. But now that the moment had come, he didn't feel the satisfaction he had expected. There was no victory in this, only the hollow ache of knowing the damage could never be undone. Your apology doesn't change anything, Jacob said, his voice tired but final. You can't fix what you've broken. Margaret lowered her head, her guilt weighing on her like a heavy burden. Mia took a step forward, her eyes locked on Margaret, her resolve unshaken. I don't forgive you, Mia said quietly but with conviction. What you did to me, to us. It's unforgivable. Margaret's eyes filled with despair, but she didn't argue. She knew there was no redemption for her actions. Mia's gaze softened slightly, and she spoke again, her voice calmer now. But I don't need your apology, she continued, her tone steady. I don't need anything from you. You've taken enough from me already. Jacob watched as his daughter stood tall, refusing to let Margaret's actions define her any longer. A surge of pride mixed with sorrow flooded through him as he realized that despite all the years lost, Mia was strong enough to move forward, to start anew. We're done here, Jacob said finally, his voice steady, though his heart felt heavy. There's nothing more to say. Margaret looked as though she might protest, but instead she nodded, defeated. Wordlessly, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps heavy with the weight of her guilt. Jacob didn't watch her leave. He didn't need to. As far as he was concerned, Margaret was no longer part of their lives. When the door closed behind her, the room fell into a deep silence. Jacob and Mia stood there, neither of them speaking at first, both lost in their thoughts. The confrontation that had just unfolded seemed too much to absorb, too raw, too final. Finally, Mia let out a long breath and turned to Jacob. What happens now? Jacob looked at her, his heart full of both love and regret. Now we move forward, he said softly. We rebuild together. Mia smiled, though there was still a sadness in her eyes. It's going to take time. I know, Jacob replied, stepping closer and placing a hand on her shoulder. But we have time now. We have each other. Mia nodded. For the first time in a long time, Jacob felt a sense of peace, however fleeting. The past would always be there with its scars, its pain. But they didn't have to let it define their future. They had found each other again, and that was enough. As they stood together in the quiet room, the weight of everything that had happened began to lift, even if only slightly. There was still healing to be done, still pieces to pick up. But they would do it together. The long, painful journey of the last 20 years had finally come to an end, and now they could start again.